John, always a great pleasure having you in the studio with us. Thank you so much for joining us. The Francis Miracle, Inside the Transformation of the Pope and the Church. That's your new book. Another book about the Pope, though. What distinguishes this book from any other?
Well, first of all, Liz, you're welcome for my being here, although my philosophy in life is never say no to Liz. So here we
Everyone should incorporate
that
I
think
philosophy.
So too, don't you? What makes this book different? Well, you are right. I mean, one of the measures that you're a pop culture phenomenon is when a whole cottage industry of sort of Instabooks grows up around you, and that is certainly true of Francis. The novel element of this book is I think it's really the first book in English that is not a biography of the Pope, but an analysis of the papacy. That is not so much the Argentine background of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, although we do devote a chapter to that, because you can't understand the man without knowing where he comes from. But this is really a sort of topical study of the key points of his reform agenda. So what he's trying to do on finances, what he's trying to do to respond to the church's child sexual abuse scandals, what he's trying to do in terms of diplomacy and geopolitics. And on and on, in trying to understand who Francis is and then how that projects into making sense of the choices he's making as Pope.
And you say you took great pains with the language in the book. You said a lot of the language had to be adapted for you to, reach your general purpose, which was to talk about the papacy.
Well, sure, but I mean, the problem with writing a book about the papacy is that it's not over yet. I mean, it is very much a work in progress.
Sure.
And further, Liz, if there was one thing I have learned about Pope Francis over 2 years of covering him day in and day out, it's that this pontiff ought to come with a warning label like a pack of cigarettes that says, "Caution, predictions are hazardous to your health."
I agree.
You just never know what he's going to do. So the language in this book is very conditional. That is, I'll say, okay, here's what he's done so far on the financial front, for example, a very ambitious house cleaning of the Vatican's financial operation, which is intended to have ripple effects on the church at other levels. But how that's going to play out at the level of detail, we don't yet know. So what I do is a lot of sort of armchair forecasting.
Sure.
I say, well, if things break one way, here's the end game. If they break another way, here's what might develop.
You talk about the warning labels, and I couldn't agree with you more. He's fearless. He has a very fearless approach to this papacy. My question to you is, will this be a famous legacy or an infamous legacy on the part of this Pope, in your opinion?
Well, Liz, answers to those questions are always very much in the eye of the beholder. I mean, is Pope Benedict XVI's legacy famous or infamous? And I suspect you would get different answers depending on who you ask. That said, I think it is quite clear that this is not simply a kind of seat-warming, keeping the machinery running while we figure out what we want to do sort of papacy. This is a Pope who has an ambitious reform agenda. I mean, he was elected on a reform mandate. And he knows that, and he's been trying to deliver, and I think the pace at which he has been moving is just absolutely mind-blowing. Beyond that, I mean, if you want to ask, is this Pope going to be famous? That's in some ways a dumb question, because he already is.
He already is famous,
we're talking about a guy who recently broke the 16 million following mark for his following on Twitter.
Yes.
Okay, we're talking about a Pope who has poll numbers in every corner of the world where public opinion can be scientifically measured.
He has placed his stamp on history.
Politicians and celebrities would sacrifice their kids to pagan gods to obtain. I was with him in Manila when he drew a crowd of 6 million people, and the thing to know about that is it was in the middle of a typhoon. Okay,
wow.
So I don't think there's any question that this Pope has already achieved fame. I think the
question
is that fame going to translate into success in his reform agenda? And that's where I think the jury is still out.
All right, the Pope is trying to reform the entire Vatican bureaucracy. We do know this. Why do you believe Francis meets with such resistance?
Okay, well, first of all, I think the resistance to Francis thing has been kind of radically overblown.
Okay.
I mean, I've covered 3 popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis. All 3 had significant internal resistance, including inside the Vatican. I mean, I would put it to you differently. Okay, Francis is the 266th Pope, and he is the 266th Pope to have some problems with his bishops.
Okay.
I mean, it's just built into the system. The Catholicism is a kind of motley crew, right? There are 1.2 billion Catholics all over the world. There are 5,000 Catholic bishops in the world. There are more than 200 cardinals in the world. And to pretend that any one of those groups is always going to think the same thing all the time on every issue is just a fantasy.
It's a fantasy.
Okay, so sure, I mean, there has been some resistance to Francis inside the system. I don't think that's anything new. And further, I don't think there's any indication that he has been hampered by it.
You've covered 3 popes. What has surprised you the most about Francis, this seemingly mild-mannered man that walked onto the Vatican balcony 2 years ago, yet is so different than the first person we were introduced to? Were you surprised at all? Are you surprised at all?
Well, first of all, unlike, say, Pope Benedict, who I had known exceptionally well before he got elected, I had only met Jorge Mario Bergoglio twice.
Okay.
Once was in 2001 for a Synod of Bishops. The other was in 2005 during the conclave. So I didn't have a strong personal read on the man. I knew what you could know at a distance. But, obviously, immediately after he was elected, I spent time vetting the new pope, went down to Argentina for a couple of weeks to do the kind of backstory on the new pope. I think probably the most surprising thing, and this is actually the point of the word miracle in the title of the book, The Francis Miracle. I do think there's something that almost requires supernatural explanation about this pope, in this sense, that if you did one of those personality inventories, like the Minnesota Multiphasic or something, of the College of Cardinals in 2013, and tried to identify the guy least likely to set the world on fire as a pop culture icon,
That would be
you
him.
probably would have come up with Bergoglio. I
Yes.
mean, his reputation in Argentina prior to his election was he hated appearing in public, almost never did it. When he did, his friends would say he came off as shy. His critics would say he came off as boring. But in any event, nobody saw him as a live wire. Okay. He almost never smiled in public. I mean, you will look in vain for pictures of a beaming Cardinal Bergoglio, prior to his election. What crystallized this for me, Liz, was when I was in Buenos Aires. I went out to visit his sister, Maria Elena, who's the only surviving sibling. And I asked her to compare the man she now sees as Pope Francis with the brother that she knows. And her answer was, who is this guy? I mean, what have you done with my brother?
Wow.
Because there just is a transformation that has come over him. And I've worked long and hard to try to figure out what the secret to that transformation was. And I am not by nature a mystic. Okay, I don't look for mystical explanations under every rock. But I do think in this case you almost have to go there. I mean, because people have asked Francis this question, longtime friends. A friend of mine who's a cardinal from Latin America who has known Bergoglio for decades told me a year or so ago that he had a private meeting with Francis. And he said to him, because they have the kind of relationship where you can do this, he said to him directly, look, you are not the same guy I knew in Buenos Aires. What's happened to you? And the answer was that on the night of my election, I had an experience of the closeness of God that has given me a sense of interior freedom and interior peace that has just never left me.
Okay.
In other words, there was a touch with the divine there that has freed up this sort of public, the face of sort of compassion and mercy
And we've watched
outreach.
it happen.
And we've
throughout
watched
the
it
course
happen. And to me, that's the most stunning thing about all of this.